Hello, and thank you for taking the time to come visit our booth at Cultivate Virtual. My name is Kevin Donnelly. I'm a horticultural soil scientist at Midwest Trading. I wanted to take the opportunity today to kind of go over product selection as well as guide through our standard products. When you're choosing a substrate, it's important to consider a number of key factors because these play a very important role in the types of mixes that you're going to use and that can be successful in your application. The irrigation method, for instance, it can be an important one. If you're on drip irrigation, overhead, or flood irrigation, the types of mixes that are going to be ideal in those situations can vary. For instance, overhead irrigation, having that water percolate directly through is not going to be that big of an issue. On a drip, you're going to want that mix more to be able to move that water horizontally throughout the mix. Otherwise, you're just going to have channeling, and you don't want that. You're not going to get full saturation. And certainly with flood irrigation, you want that water to be able to come up from below, and so certain types of mixes are going to perform better than others in those situations. Your crop time and your container size are also two very important ones. The container size is more of the container height, because as you go larger, there's more force being put on the mix and there's more compactive effort just from the mix itself being on top of it. So for instance, like a pine bark based mix is not going to compress as much on itself, whereas peat, a heavy peat mix might, depending on how tall you end up going. Your crop time, short-term crops can, the types of mixes you're going to use and be successful in those. Typically on the heavy peat side, if you get into, certainly perennials and shrubs and stuff like that, as you get longer term, you're going to need components that are going to hold up long term from a structural standpoint, so you don't lose any of that air porosity, drainage, and other things that are important to keep the crop going for the long term. Your fertilization strategy, if you're needing to do controlled release fertilizer as your fertilizer, that's what you're going to put into the mix. Or if you if you're fertigating, how many mixes you can actually have. Most people, they're going to have one mix that they want to do everything that they do, and that's a great option, especially if you don't have a lot of space or resources, or your volumes are not necessarily matching to justify a second or third mix. Or if you do have that ability, then finding that specific mix that's going to be ideal for your mum crop or for your poinsettia crop, or if you're going to be doing shrubs for the first time, something like that. You might want to have a separate mix in order to do something different. How you handle the product, if you're taking it bulk, bagged, in totes, what kind of equipment you're using for a pot filler, those things can play a role. Certainly cost is a big one. If you can't afford the mix, it doesn't really matter if it's good or bad. We certainly have to make these mixes affordable so that we can be profitable as a company, as a grower. And then once you have that mix, it's important that it's consistent, because you want that mix to perform predictably every single time, so that this entire bench of annuals is all going to be ready at the same time. You don't have, when you have to go pick the plants for sale, you're not getting little bits here and there because they're not consistently growing over time. Some common products, what we see certainly in the Midwest, we're based out of Chicago. Again, as you go from smaller crops and shorter crop times, smaller containers and shorter crop times, up into larger containers and longer crop times, your mixes are going to start to change. Most annual production, going from plugs to about 6-inch pots, heavy on the peat, so a lot of times some bark component in there, and perlite, core, vermiculite, those kinds of common ingredients. As you go further up in the scale, you're going to be using more bark, less peat, maybe throwing in some compost and sand. The cost of the mix, you try to handle the cost a little bit better, because you don't want to put a really expensive mix into 5-gallon containers. You want to try and manage that cost as best you can, because the cost of the mix becomes a larger percentage of the unit cost to produce that product when you have a larger container. We produce everything on the spectrum, from your small annual crops, mixes that are ideal for that, all the way up into the trees and shrubs and countless other types of applications as well. We do customize. We have the ability to custom mix lots of different components. Please reach out if you have a unique situation or an application that doesn't necessarily covered by our standard list that I'm going to go over. We have the conversation, determine what makes sense for you, work with you in order to see if we have a solution that we can provide. So going into our mixes, first one, obviously going in the same order. So our 80-20, 80% peat, 20% perlite, that is a staple in the industry. great for your smaller crops, for your shorter crop time. As you get longer, certainly like full season containers, if you're doing mixed containers, that may not hold up as well long term from a structural standpoint, and that size of container as well could be an issue because it could compress on itself. Because peat moss, it does, even when applying proper wetting agent, initially, unless you're continually applying that wetting agent, you can start getting that dry down, and the challenge is re-wetting that mix. Flattened pack, Flattened Pack Plus, with the parboiled rice hulls and the core mix. These are all the Flattened Pack family, what we're based off of the Flattened Pack, as you can kind of see. They're all variants on that. Very common mix, obviously it's peat based with pine bark and perlite. The Flattened Pack Plus has some vermiculite in it. Those two are probably our biggest sellers in the industry right now. The parboiled rice does the same job as perlite, and it's an alternative that some people really, really like, and they're having lots of success with. The parboiled rice is a lower cost option for perlite, so you're going to have some cost savings there, as well as it is more sustainable than perlite, and so some growers use that as a story or as in their marketing efforts in order to promote the way that they grow, because their clients and the people they sell to value that. I mean, that's an option there, but certainly the cost does help out. And then the core mix takes a little bit of that peat moss out, puts in some coconut coir. Like I mentioned with the 80-20, over time it becomes harder to re-wet some of those peat-based mixes, and certainly if there's no wetting agent, or it just sat around a really long time, that wetting agent broke down, it can be very hard to re-wet peat, as I'm sure lots of people have experienced. Core doesn't have that issue. So core re-wets really easily. So the core mix allows you to re-wet that crop easier over time. It does hold more water. You wouldn't want to go straight core versus peat, because it doesn't quite do the same job as peat moss as far as providing structure and water retention and air porosity, but it does help a lot. And so those are those kind of on the small side. You can use the Flattened Pack through core mix for most things that you're going to grow. You're going to have a lot of success because it can handle the larger containers on the longer term. Then getting into the larger containers, the longer crop times, we have our high porosity and our basket mix. Those two are similar to the Flattened Pack and the core mix, because the high porosity just has more pine bark compared to peat moss than the Flattened Pack. Otherwise, it's basically the same. It's just more bark versus peat. And the basket mix is the same thing for core. There's a higher bark content than in the core mix. These mixes are great when you're going from, let's say, 6 inch and above. Anything below 6 inches kind of out of its ideal range. You can still use it, but you might run into some situations where it doesn't retain water as long, or it doesn't hold as much water, and so you could have dry down issues, things starting to wilt. Certainly in the middle of the summer, if you're starting things that don't have established root systems, you could have some challenges. But on the larger side, they're going to perform that much better, right? They're going to hold up that much longer. If you have issues with drainage or things staying a little bit too wet, these kinds of mixes would be good solutions in those situations. Again, we're talking about ideal applications versus what it can do. Most of these mixes you could use just about anywhere, but where it's kind of ideal, or what they're designed specifically for, or what they have designed in mind, the application is what you want to look at. Moving on, the large container. Large container, and also what we call the all-purpose potting soil for our Landscaper Pro series. Those are basically the same mixes, but that they're pine-based mixes. They're using both coarse and fine pine bark, peat moss, and core. We've taken the perlite out because the bark itself actually acts as that structure, as that aggregate, in order to maintain structure and provide that air porosity and the drainage that is necessary. The all-purpose potting soil, which we sell to the landscape market and to retailers and other stuff, it contains a controlled release fertilizer in it, and it's like a ready-to-go bagged material, where the large container is more of the production mix, where you'd add your own fertilizer or your fertigating yourself. These mixes work really, really well. They hold up amazingly in large containers. I mean, the all-purpose potting soil, when it has the CRF in it, it does amazing. I mean, it just outperforms my expectations, certainly every year in seasonal containers that we trial it in. The poinsettia mix, instead of using a horticultural grade peat moss, which is what you're typically going to see in a lot of these mixes, it's using a coarse grade. The coarse grade peat moss then provides that structure that you would get from bark or from perlite, whatever, and it's going to help hold up because it is a coarser fiber. Then we have coir and perlite in it. And this, again, because poinsettias are a longer term crop, you want it to maintain that re-wetting that you're going to need long term, which is why the coir is in there, and that structure. And so it's a really good mix for those kinds of applications, not just poinsettias, but we had to give it a name of some kind. And so that's kind of what it's designed for, but it can be used for many, many different types of crops in those larger containers. Probably, again, 6-inch and above is probably where you're going to find the ideal range for that. As we continue on, starting to move towards more what we would consider hybrid nursery greenhouse mixes, the mums. Our mum mixes, our standard mum mixes, you can grow mums in a lot of things. Our standard mixes are pine-based with peat moss and perlite, or with parboiled rice hulls. These mixes, as a standard, we also have options for different kinds of CRF, either an Osmocote or a Harrell's CRF. You can look on our price list and see the different options that we have for those mixes. Again, mums long term, you're going to want that drainage you're going to have. And so that's basically the greenhouse mixes we have that are on our list. We do go into, in our catalog, different nursery mixes we have. And again, like I mentioned before, we customize so much. So certainly if you have a question, don't be afraid. Call us, ask, reach out, and we can discuss what options we have. We've designed mixes for all sorts of specialty crops, whether it's blueberries and other ericaceous, shrub material, interior scapes, and we do also go into lots of engineered soils on the landscaping side as well. But from a production standpoint, we've done quite a bit from altering the pH and altering the structure, and incorporating different types of materials, whether it's like Root Shield Plus, mycorrhizae, various different products into those mixes. So feel free to reach out. Thank you for your time. Again, my name is Kevin Donnelly, and we appreciate you visiting our booth today.